This Fed Gov Today program is sponsored by TrackVia. On this edition of Fed Gov Today, a warning for AI changes on the multiple award schedule.
We attract really smart people who attract capital and other smart people, and they build amazing world-class solutions, right? And the government ought not to do anything that gets in the way of them being able to leverage those solutions, right? And this clause potentially could do that.
Former FAST Commissioner Alan Thomas on Fed Gov Today in just a moment. Federal programs are still running on spreadsheets, SharePoint, and systems built with old technology. That creates more work and slows things down. TrackVia Government is a workflow modernization platform that lets agencies and prime partners quickly digitize program delivery, field services, compliance reporting, and operations, delivering secure audit-ready workflows without lengthy implementations. Modern, mobile, mission-ready. Learn more at trackvia.com/government. The General Services Administration is reviewing comments now on a draft of changes it wants to make to the multiple award schedule. The revision would include big changes around transactional data reporting and AI. Alan Thomas is founder of Alpha Tango Strategies. He's former commissioner of the Federal Acquisition Service at GSA. Alan, welcome. It's great to have you on the program. Talked about this a little bit on the TV show this past weekend with your former colleague, Tom Howder. What's your take on what you see in Revision 31 and what it means for the vendors that want to sell to the government and to what the government will do, especially at the agency level, all across government? Welcome, Alan.
Thanks. Glad to be here. Yeah, two big parts to Revision 31 and some news that there's now that part of it's been moved to potentially refresh 32, right? So TDR, as you mentioned, transactional data reporting. TDR is going to apply to everything on schedule now, right? Not just not just some of the products and the select SINs that it did earlier. That's a big deal, Francis, because it's going to include services and it's going to include what the government calls highly configurable products. So think of a laptop that might have 60, 70, 80 different configurations. It means it's going to be way more complex for vendors to report the data on those, on services and on highly configurable products. And it's going to be a little more complex for the government to figure out what to do with it, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is the AI clause in there. And that, that's been broken out now. I think the government realized, GSA realized, wow, we're going to get a lot of comments on that. And the comments might not be particularly favorable. So they've essentially created an extension for that to give industry till April 3rd to respond on the AI clause specifically. And they've said they'll consider addressing that AI clause as part of Refresh 32. So they realized, hey, we need to break that out, right? So 31 is going to be all, there's a bunch of stuff in there, but it's basically going to be all about TDR.
You said that all of the TDR data that will be required now will make this more complex. Will that necessarily make it more burdensome for the companies, or is it just more work to do? I mean, maybe that's the same thing.
Well, yeah, it's a little more work to do because it just applies to a lot more things, right? But it applies to some things that the government and industry haven't quite figured out how they're going to report on this. For example, I've got a fixed price services contract, right? I've got, say it's $5 million worth of work or something. What do I report? Do I just report $5 million? Do I report, the monthly fee that that the government pays me? And then if that's all I report, then how does how does that help the government buyer in terms of getting that data and ultimately using it in negotiation, right? So there's some complexity around that. And I think, to GSA's credit, right, they've said, hey, we don't necessarily have all the answers on this yet, right? They've set up some standing office hours with the multiple award schedule PMO. They've got a dedicated inbox to answer questions from industry around this. So I think, as usual, GSA is committed, right, to making sure they help industry and they kind of work their way through this. But in the back of industry's mind, they're thinking, hey, if you make me break out, labor categories and hours and rates for fixed price contracts, that's a non-starter for most professional services firms.
And hasn't that always been the issue with TDR about services, though, is Alan Thomas is one level of accomplishment of a consultant on a particular contract. Francis Rose is a completely different entity. And evaluating that quantitatively, if I'm not as good as you, I shouldn't get paid as much as you, and I'm not worth as much to the government as you are. And I guess that strikes me as a huge complexity that I don't think anybody's figured out how to overcome. How do you evaluate all those things and account for them in reporting that data?
That's right. I mean, you can compare labor categories, right? If you have like labor categories, right, that require a certain amount of say, years of experience, right, and education and things like that, right? I can compare that. And for time and materials work, that completely makes sense. But it gets challenging when you talk about fixed price contracts, right? The other thing I think from industry standpoint, and like we should actually take just one step back and remember the reason TDR is being implemented is because it's getting rid of something that's pretty burdensome for industry, which is the price reduction clause, right? And so, everyone should just remember that. That's kind of the original impetus for TDR, and that's a good thing, right? I mean, I think it's going to get the government more data that they can then use to turn around and negotiate, right? Hopefully negotiate better deals for the taxpayer. I think the one thing that maybe some folks in industry are potentially a little bit leery of is right now there are, I think, 12 mandatory data elements that the government's asking for in TDR and 4 optional, right? So the industry's reporting on 16 data elements. There's always the chance that there's what I call the Christmas tree effect happens, right? Where, some stakeholder says, boy, it'd be great to get a couple more data elements here and a couple more there, right? And, everybody says, I just put 2 or 3 ornaments on the tree. And pretty soon you look up and, the tree has way too many ornaments. And from an industry perspective, you're like, wow, this thing that started off removing one burden has potentially we're nowhere near that point yet. And hopefully we never get there. And I don't think that's the government's intention, but it's always an unintended consequence or a possibility.
Well, and that means that to avoid that, it's going to have to be somebody's job to say, no, we're not going to do that when somebody says, we think this is a good idea.
That's correct. That's right.
Whose job should that be, and why is it historically difficult for I'm not picking on GSA. It's happened all across government. Why has that historically been difficult for somebody to say no to?
I think it's industry job to be vigilant about that, right? I mean, I think they ought to be happy that the price reduction clause is going away, and I think GSA's got an open hand, and industry should grab it, right? And they should collaborate and figure out how to do this the right way, right? But that's ultimately industry's job and the trade associations that help represent those industry members, right, to make sure that this doesn't become overly burdensome in the future. And look, GSA generally is a good, honest broker, right, between government agencies and industry. So they've got a vested interest too in making sure that they get the right information that the government needs in order to negotiate good deals, but that they don't create something that's just too burdensome. So I'm reasonably confident that's not going to happen, but the possibility is always there.
You mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that since I talked to Tom on the television show, GSA's taken the AI provisions out of 31 and going to add them potentially to 32 and or push them to the future even maybe. I'm saying that, not you.
Yep.
But it strikes me, the cynic in me thinks that when that happens, it's because they realized we're probably not going to like what we're going to hear as far as the comments go. Is that a fair read on the part of this one, do you think?
I think that's a fair read. Yeah, I mean, this is, when I read through it, I was surprised. I mean, the government, it's a kind of maximalist negotiating position from the government standpoint around intellectual property, around data rights, and around sort of supply chain implications. It creates potentially a lot of burden for industry in a number of areas. And I think it could potentially even kind of stifle innovation and for some new players who might be thinking about entering the government market, a clause like this as written could potentially be a disincentive to even get in and serve the market, right? So I think the government's well-intentioned in this, right? And in some areas like supply chain, I get where they're coming from. In other areas, I look at it and I say, it feels like kind of a move away from what GSA has been doing over the last few years, where the GSA oftentimes tries to be more flexible and sort of mirror commercial terms and conditions, right? And this seems a little bit of a move away from that. So it was surprising in that respect. I think industry is going to push back pretty hard through trade associations. I haven't really talked to anybody who's going to put their own name on it,
yeah,
right? But they might breathe a little fire through the trades, and I think ultimately you'll probably see some changes to this clause.
It would be fun to look at Roger Waldron's inbox right about now, wouldn't it?
Indeed, it would.
At least as far as refresh 30 now 32 goes. What is the outcome that you think is likely to happen with Refresh 31? Do you think there was anything controversial enough that the comments would cause GSA to do anything different when it comes to the TDR and price reduction clause stuff?
I don't think so. No. I mean, I think industry might want a little more clarity on some reporting and how that's going to happen around TDR. But I think GSA has essentially said, "Hey, we're going to work that out with you over the next 6 months or 12 months," right? So yeah, I don't see anything that would cause Refresh 31 to get held up, right? 30 or the AI. I mean, the government's acknowledged, "Hey, we're going to give industry 2 more weeks to comment on it, and then we'll think about what we do with it," right? So that feels like an open negotiation. Remember, that is all happening also the backdrop of the Department of War, Department of Defense, whatever you like to call them, and Anthropic, that whole issue, right? And so I think that really got people were focused on this and aware of it before, but that issue really made people read this AI clause in a different way, read it more closely, and think about the potential implications of it. They understand it could be much more serious.
Final thought, Alan. How does this fit with some of the other things that are going on at your former agency, like the FAR overhaul, OneGov initiative, things like that?
Well, I think these schedule refreshes, right, or updates of terms and conditions, are oftentimes in responses and things in the FAR overhaul. I think that the move to institute TDR across the entire schedules program makes sense. It's consistent with that. The AI clause, again, I said I was a bit surprised by it, right? I think it flies a little bit in the face of GSA wanting to to do things in a little bit more commercial way and reflect commercial terms, particularly around software and technology. So that I was a little surprised, I think, by that. So we'll see. Again, I think there's some compromise here. I mean, look, the one thing you don't want to do from a government standpoint is, the one advantage that the United States has in this race for AI is we attract really smart people who attract capital and other smart people, and they build amazing world-class solutions, right? And the government ought not to do anything that gets in the way of them being able to leverage those solutions, right? And this clause potentially could do that, right? So I think industry is going to have their say, and then I think you're probably going to see some tweaks or some changes to the language in the clause.
It's great to have you on the program as always, Alan. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
You can read more about the multiple award schedule proposal on today's show page at fedgovtoday.com. The next Fed Gov Today podcast is coming tomorrow. The outgoing CISO at DHS has a new home. You'll hear about it from Hemant Bedwan. He's on the show tomorrow. I'm Francis Rose. I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening.